Course. All right, 24 minutes before 11 o'clock. Thank you for tuning in. I have always been fascinated with the idea of a time machine. And we do not have somebody on the phone right now that's going to tell you they invented one. But we do have somebody on the phone that has written one. If you read A World on Edge, just allow yourself to be in the place that Daniel Schonpflug has written about, and you will feel like you've gone in a time machine. This takes you back to just after the First World War and what at least the Western world was going through in those years. Daniel Schonpflug, and he's going to correct my pronunciation and when we get him on, he's a professor of history at the Free University of Berlin in Germany. He's the academic coordinator of the, Wissenschaftskollege. Am I saying that right, Robin?
So.
The Institute for Advanced Study in Berlin. He's a lecturer and an author, and you're going to love the book, especially if you like that period in history. It was a real period of change, and for some reason we forget about it a lot because we focus a lot on the Second World War. This, of course, is just after the First World War. A World on Edge. Daniel Schonpflug, please, thank you so much for being on the air. Please excuse my mispronunciation of your name.
Hello, Larry. Thank you so much for having me, and don't worry about Schonpflug. No one in the world can pronounce it but the Germans.
Well, I'm going to try. Schonpflug. Is that how you said it, Schonpflug?
Wonderful, wonderful. You're doing great.
And my mom was from Germany. My mom moved here when she was 3. My grandfather served in World War I on the German side.
Oh, do you have stories from him?
Oh, I have a little tiny one, yeah. Are you in Germany right now?
Yes, I'm calling from Berlin, Germany.
Oh, my gosh. See, that's what on my bucket list is to visit your country because of the roots that I have. I have never visited there.
Please do. It's a city that's ever-changing, and there's so much to discover, not only history.
But I do know how to say I love you in German. Ich liebe dich.
Go for it. Come on.
I learned 2 things from my grandmother. Ich liebe dich and Hast du Fleur? She always would ask her dog if she had fleas, so...
Wonderful. Great.
So tell me about the book. I described to the audience that it was like a time machine. We go back in time to this era, and you've managed to help us feel the intricacies of the turmoil that was going on in both a good way and in a not so good way.
Yeah, well, it was like a time machine for me. I got involved with this project some 4 or 5 years ago. It was parallelly a film project, a theater project, and I wrote this book. Museums were involved too. And I started to read sources from that time, people who wrote about their experiences in their autobiographies, in letters, in their diaries. And reading these documents, I actually felt like in a time machine because they were taking me back to the experience of what it was like to live in November 1918. And it was, for me, the biggest discovery in these reads was actually that the time was different from what I would have imagined and what historians are imagining, because they see, looking back and knowing what happened later, they see this time as a very gloomy, dark, destructive time. They see the end of a huge war and the breakdown of a world order. What they're not seeing is how much hope there was, how many dreams there was, how much openness there was. The future was really open for people who lived that moment, and they were imagining it in exciting and different ways. Mm-hmm. And this discovery really made it very intense for me.
You hit on the one thing that I was most stricken by was the fact that the hierarchy of the past was starting to dissolve, so that somebody who And again, this mostly applies to Western culture. I don't know that it's the entire world, but Europe and America for sure were starting to realize that you could be born into a lower class and actually make something of yourself.
Well, not only in the West. I mean, this one of the discoveries I made is how global this moment of 1918 was. So in my book, there's also someone like Gandhi or Lawrence of Arabia, or the later Ho Chi Minh, so people coming from Asia or from like other parts of the world. And for them, this moment also was pivotal, and they also felt this opening up. The experiences you're describing was particularly strong in those countries where 1918 brought regime change and often a radical redefinition also of political system. For example, in Germany, where voting rights were extended, or in many countries of the European East and of the former Ottoman Empire, where republics were established, and they brought completely new experiences and possibilities for a variety of people.
Wow. What do you think that World War I, the Great War, caused that to happen, or were those changes inevitable anyway?
Well, they had already started in many countries, or the pressure for change was already there. But in many of these places of the world, there were regimes in place that were blocking that change. That is true certainly for Germany. That is true for Turkey. This is true for the huge Russian Empire, also for the Austrian Empire. Those were all rather conservative countries and conservative regimes that were able to withhold all the creative energy, political and also artistic, social, and so the destructive forces of the war that took these regimes down were the same that freed the dynamic that we're seeing right after 1918.
What was communication contributing to those changes as well? I don't think radio was quite common in those days, but certainly publications were becoming very streamlined. Do you think that helped?
Radio came up a little later in the 20s and was very influential then, but at that time you have two mediums which are really important. Mass press, which already started in the late 19th century with the possibility to reach out to people via newspapers and print. And then cinema, which back then was really becoming a mass medium in the West, and which always had, every cinema session also had a news show in the beginning, so that people would be informed, quite up to date, with things happening in their country, but also all over the world. And these kinds of communication systems certainly allowed for a quick spread of news. I mean, the telephone was already around, which also, in these revolutionary settings made a huge difference. For example, the German Kaiser learned about his own abdication only on the telephone.
Is that right? Oh my God! So tell me about what was Harry Truman going through in those years, because we don't think of Harry Truman until the Second World War, but you've actually got some information about him during the after the years of the First World War.
Exactly. So he was an army officer, artillery officer in World War I, and we know about his experiences because he wrote wonderful letters to his beloved future wife, Beth Wallace. And in these letters, he describes his war experience. Actually, in the end of the war, he is exhausted after a long and very, very hard campaign as an artillery officer. He describes the experiences of being, on the one hand, far from the front, but being directly involved with the arms that he is using. He also describes the end of the war as a bit of a disappointment. So on the 11th November, 11 o'clock, where you would expect, people to be enthusiastic, he's a bit disappointed. First of all, because he would have wanted the army to move into Germany and to really, keep on pushing until Berlin, until total defeat, just to be sure that the Germans are really won over. And the other thing is, he was hoping, before the war he had read some Napoleon and Caesar, so he was hoping to become a big war hero and promoted maybe until he was general. And this hadn't happened. So for these two reasons, he was a bit disappointed, but very satisfied that he hadn't lost a single man from his unit. So that he could, his responsibility as an officer had really carried him through.
Talk about Germany a little bit, and if I could ask you to contrast the post-World War I years with the post-World War II years, I would appreciate that. And I specifically want to know about Germany because obviously what happened in the years between World War I and World War II greatly made a difference regarding World War II. So what did we make a mistake? Did the rest of the West make a mistake after World War I and not embrace Germany the way we should have so that we could have prevented the Nazi Party and all those things that Hitler ended up doing?
So I think one thing that we have to see more, and it's something that is really starting to be seen more here in Germany, is that this post-war area of World War I is not only the beginning of the terrible rise of National Socialism and somehow the beginning of World War II. It is also a very utopian moment. I mean, Germany has a full-blown revolution for the first time in its history. It's establishing a republic, and this republic is able to survive under extremely difficult circumstances. This is something that should be appreciated, especially now in times when our democracy is less stable than it used to be. We have to remember that, this republic first came up through a revolution, and that people were ready to fight for democracy, and that is something that we should see more. Then, coming more directly to your question, of course, the way that the armistice and the peace treaty was negotiated had consequences for inner politics in Germany. And especially the French were very, very determined to make Germany pay for the huge damage that it has done, especially on France during the World War. And that, together with the psychological effect of maybe somewhat triumphalist Allied front, created a kind of a back push in Germany. I don't say that the peace treaty was unfair, but by pushing, especially the reparations, to a certain limit, the readiness of many Germans to stay in a mindset of enmity towards the neighbors, and especially on the right, to wait for opportunities to come back and to take revenge, to bring Germany back to to a more stable, also international position. That was really strong. So I suppose that a more balanced, more forgiving approach to these peace negotiations would have made a change. If it could have kept National Socialism from emerge, that is a question that is difficult for a historian to answer, but certainly that was one of the factors.
Your book sort of helps me with a question I've always had about my own family. My grandfather, like I mentioned, served in World War I on the German side and left Germany for New York in 1925. Your book sort of helps me understand why he left, but I also wonder why he left, because it looks like things were getting better, but maybe not quick enough. I still don't really know the answer, but it sort of helps me.
So the post-war years are not only politically but also economically extremely difficult, and there's the hyperinflation crisis of 23 that really, ruins the lives of so many people. Fortunes are, vanishing overnight. People are losing jobs, and unemployment really rises. And even though there's a certain stabilization after that, the so-called golden 20s were not golden for many people. most people suffered and lived under difficult conditions, and especially the working classes were really poor with problems of disease and social disintegration. So living conditions were really hard. And in my book, there's an example of those people, those soldiers coming back from World War I. Richard Stumpf, he's a sailor in Wilhelmshaven in the north of Germany. He lives through the first days of revolution and then becomes kind of a revolutionary himself in this context. Very soon he goes back to his hometown of Nuremberg. He has a hard time to find a job after all these years of fighting, then makes a living with little income, then is attracted to the extreme right, so basically becomes a fighter again, fights in the revolutionary a battle in Munich, then sees that this is not an option for him, but he really doesn't make it back to a quieter form of life until after World War II. And I mean, this is just one example of millions of young German men returning from the war without a true perspective. And so going into exile, leaving the country, is certainly an option that many people took. And the other option, which is tragic for Germany, is go into one of these illegal army units, which at least provide you with some kind of stability and basically fight the Republic and prepare for the next war.
Daniel Schonpflug is our guest, and again, I hope I'm pronouncing your name close to right. The book is called A World on Edge: The End of the Great War and the Dawn of a New Age. As a lecturer, I have a question for you, Daniel. I'm curious, when you lecture, I'm going to presume you lecture in Germany as well as in the States?
I have lectured in the States, but it's been a while.
But I'm wondering if the audience that invites you, or the institution that invites you, whether it's a school or something else, are they curious about different things depending on where you lecture?
Yes, absolutely. So the book has been published in 12 countries, so I travel quite a lot to speak about it, to present it, and I'm really amazed how different the reactions are. So I'm just coming back from France, from Versailles, which is the place where the peace treaty was finally negotiated and signed. And of course the French perspective is different from the German one, because it's not only a country that is on the winning side, but also they did not have a revolution, not a regime change. So for them it's more a question of coming to terms with the massive cause of defending their republic. When I speak to American citizens or British citizens, one question that they really have a hard time to understand is that in Germany we have no commemorative culture for the First World War and for the end of First World War. On the 11th of November, here in Germany, here in Berlin, hardly anything happens, and not even the remembrance of all these 2 million dead soldiers really has a visible place in our public culture. And I mean, coming from the United States or from Britain, where this is very important and is really a major event almost every year, this is hard to understand. So I take some time to explain that, why that is.
I just ordered the audiobook, by the way. I want to listen to it in the car. Is it your voice on the audio?
No, it's been read by a wonderful actor, and he reads it so much better than I could. I have I speak some English, but I couldn't make that work.
So you wrote it in German originally, and it was translated for you?
Exactly. So I wrote it in German, and then it was translated into 10 different languages.
Wow.
And the poppies have huge significance here in the States.
Yes, and the story tells the book how the poppy symbol was invented. It's the story of Moina Michael, who works for the YMCA in New York at that time. And in the beginning of the book and throughout the book, you follow her fight for the poppy symbol, because in the beginning nobody's really interested, and people think it's maybe a weird idea. But then, with a month and with her huge investment into the idea and the help of many other people, it becomes a world symbol, and especially in the English-speaking world. And it also helps to raise millions of dollars to help the veterans and those who have suffered from the war.
Let's see, who did we not cover? Was it Virginia Woolf? Did we not cover her mentioned in the book?
Yes, exactly. And it's an interesting story, but because I've been looking for people who have written intensively about this time, but also who have somehow reinvented their own life or have thought different futures. So now the months after the First World War are exactly the time when Virginia Woolf, who's completely unknown writer back then, moves into a new way of writing and is really reinventing the novel. She has ideas about how a novel should be, that she wants to look at the interior thoughts and the stream of consciousness of people, and almost like a psychologist wants to inquire about how people think and feel and document that in her literature. This is a completely new way. She calls it the new novel, and she writes about how it should be, and she writes her first different novel. It's a small book by the name of Jacob's Room, and this is the beginning of an amazing artistic revolution that really will carry on from there. And she's also, of course, reinventing her own life step by step. And after the First World War, she is a married woman without any kind of public life or outreach. She becomes a very famous author and also discovers her own femininity by moving into as you know, a lesbian relationship and kind of doing things that maybe before the war would have been a lot more difficult to live.
It's just another example of how many changes were actually happening in the world. One thing before we go, I know we have very little time, but I wanted you to, or wanted the audience to know, how the book also helps us understand the dynamic between Russia and the rest of the world, especially Russia and Europe and Russia and the U.S.
Yes, so if you think of 1918 as a moment of a new start, I mean, the Russian case has to be in it. And it's represented in the book in the figure of a very young Russian woman. She's a Cossack, and one of the few women who fought in the army in the First World War. She actually disguised as a man. She was a Cossack and went with her father to fight for the Tsar. But then the revolution comes, the Tsar is executed, and she finds herself in the turmoil of civil war. And we see through her eyes the revolution as a very ambivalent thing. On the one hand, she has admiration for the workers and the Bolshevik army that fight for a new world, but then she sees cruelties of a kind that she has never seen before, and she sees this bloodshed and chaos that Russia is really thrown into after the World War, because the war, keeps on ravaging for years in Russia. It's not over in 1918. And she can only flee all that by taking one of the last trains of the Trans-Siberian Railway, going all the way through Siberia to Vladivostok, from Vladivostok to Japan, from Japan all the way over the Pacific to the United States, and she starts a new life as a ballet dancer.
Gosh.
You have given us an amazing interview, Daniel. Thank you so much for doing this. For the listeners, I found the book on Amazon. I have a copy of the book, by the way. If I have one listener who would like it, just call me. I'll pick a call at random, and it's yours. Again, the number here is 622-9622. I found the book on Amazon. It's called A World on Edge. Daniel Schonpflug, whose name I'm probably getting close, I guess, by now. Do you have a website in addition to Amazon that you'd like to tell us about?
So I think Amazon works best to get the book or the audio book, and I think this is where most people in America can get a hand on it in the easiest way. And
I just got an audio book. I just had it delivered to my iPhone.
Nice.
I'll be listening.
Wonderful. Well,
be listening in my car. Daniel, thank you so much. How's the weather in Germany right now?
No, we're late in November. It's already very dark and chilly and rainy, so I guess you're better off in Florida.
Well, if you're ever over here, we would love to have you in the studio. Thank you so much.
Oh, thanks so much, and thank you for having me. It was great to talk to you.
Thank you. We'll be right back.
Broadcasting from the Paddock Mall Studios, this is WOCA, Ocala, Gainesville, The Villages, 1370 AM, 96.3 FM, The Source.
Here is your 1-minute news brief. Florida Governor Rick Scott is getting to pick a new judge for Northeast Florida after a state Supreme Court justice flipped his position on the case. A divided court ruled yesterday to not hear that case. Wet roads led